Hey guys, that's right here, and today I will be giving you 5 of the top free-to-play decks to use on the ladder. These decks are not only super easy to level up and max, but also have been viable in the meta for a long time, and you can be sure that they will be very effective once you learn how to play them. That being said, if you already have a ladder deck that has worked for a long time that you've also leveled up, by all means, stick to it. Sticking to a single deck can be one of the best ways to improve in Clash Royale, as you learn all of the small interactions and game plans of that deck. However, if you're interested in a new deck that will work on ladder, let's get right into the list. Number 1. Hog 2.6. Hog 2.6 is one of the most popular and well-known decks in the game, being a deck that has been consistently viable for years, that is, when in the right hands. In fact, many pros are even able to consistently reach top ladder using this deck. Pros such as Lucas X Gamer, Jack, and so on. It's an extremely free-to-play combination, as this deck is pretty much all commons and rares, making for a much easier time when trying to level it up. So it's definitely a very solid deck to play and master. So, how would you play this deck? Well, 2.6 is a cycle type deck, meaning that for the majority of the time, you will be applying pretty good pressure throughout the entire match. Unlike archetypes such as Beatdown, where you play really passive and single elixir, with this deck, you do want to maintain that fast cycle to constantly get that 1 or 2 hog hits onto your opponent's tower. In addition, by keeping that pressure up, you prevent your opponent from building up that massive push they need to overwhelm you. In addition, the super fast cycle on defense allows for you to cycle back to a second cannon, ice golem, musketeer, fireball, or you name it on defense. Another thing that you really need to know is an effective use of your cycle cards. Instead of playing them just in the back, actually use them for a purpose on defense. This will not only get you defensive value, but will also help you advance your cycle just a bit faster. Number 2. Mortar Bait. One of the most infamous decks in the ladder game, but still an effective one nonetheless, and still really easy to level up. Mortar Bait is a deck that is pretty much all common cards and combines 2 different archetypes, Bait and Siege, in a very effective and deadly combination. It has the fast cycle of a Siege deck with relatively cheap cycle cards, but also has enough firepower to completely overwhelm your opponents when played correctly. So, how do you play Mortar Bait? Well, against bigger, beatdown, or heavier decks, for example, you will be relying more on that minor bait aspect part of the deck to take down a tower and playing more defensive with that mortar. However, against cheaper cycle decks, you can afford to be a bit more aggressive with your mortars trying to get a lock onto the tower. In addition, you can also just, play something small such as goblins at the bridge to try and get some chip damage onto the tower. This will either grant you, a few hundred damage or bait a spell out of your opponent, which, when using a bait deck, can be extremely good. Number 3. Classic Bait. Oh boy, with the recent slight buffs to Goblin Barrel and Princess, Bait is back in the meta. Now this deck I am showing is a classic version of Bait, but there are so many different variations out there. So if you don't like this one, well, there's still tons of other options out there. But the reason I chose this one is because of how effective the Inferno Tower is in the current meta, with it being able to get tons of value in this meta against tons of tanky cards. In addition, with Snowball being a more popular card than Zap, fewer players have an effective way of resetting it. So how do you play Bait? Well, it says it in the name itself. You try and bait out your opponent's small spells and take advantage of that. May that be to send in that offensive Goblin Barrel or taking out some troops on defense. In addition, Bait is typically a faster cycle deck, so outcycling your opponent's small spells can be another super effective way to connect onto that tower. Also, it's very important that you don't become too predictable when using a Bait deck. On defense, switch up your defensive placements every once in a while to prevent getting predicted with your spells. On offense, throw a Juke Barrel every once in a while to really trip up your opponents. Number 4. Giant Beatdown. Now, the Giant Beatdown deck I'm talking about is this deck right here. It's a pretty classic Giant Beatdown deck that you can use from even a super low arena. Of course, there are tons of replacements you can do, Prince for Mini P.E.K.K.A, you can add in a Miner for the Ice Spear, and so on and so forth. Now, this deck is an interesting style of beatdown that's not really seen too much anymore in this meta, but is still very effective. It's a cheaper style of beatdown with the Giant. This means that you not only have the firepower of a heavy beatdown deck, but But when played correctly, you can also have the fast cycle of a cycle deck if you wanted to, with enough cheap cards to allow you to cycle at a decently fast pace. In addition, with 3 spells, it can be very difficult for players to out-cycle your spells. Now this deck, being a beatdown deck, is more passive in single elixir time, focus more on playing defense and counter-pushing with that giant. However, it's also a good decision to play giant in the back against some cheaper decks, as overwhelming them can be a bit easier overall. That being said, double elixir is your time to shine, so be sure to keep that pressure up. Number 5, 2.9 Expo. And last but not least, my favorite deck in the entire game, 2.9 Expo. 2.9 is another one of those staple decks in Clash Royale, with it being a viable deck for several years now. In fact, it's such an identifiable deck that if you see archers placed in the back or something at the start of a match, it's pretty safe to assume that you are facing an Expo. Now, what makes Expo so special? Well, it's mainly due to its fast cycle element. This deck cycles fast, and when taken advantage of correctly, it's absolutely deadly in almost any matchup. In addition, due to its 2 defensive buildings, it can be very easy for any skilled Expo player to draw out almost any matchup. So, how do you play Expo? Well, similar to most other cycle decks, you'll be playing a bit more aggressively than other decks throughout the entire match. Now, that doesn't mean placing an Expo at the bridge right at the start of a match. Instead, I mean just start off cycling your cheap cards in the back until your opponent makes the first big move. In addition, throughout the match, try and get as much chip damage as possible. Expo is somewhat of a chip cycle deck, and once you bring that tower low enough, you can fireball cycle a tower down in mere seconds. So there we go, 5 of the top free-to-play ladder decks in this meta. Now of course, these are decks that have stood the test of time and are easy to level up, but that doesn't mean you will have success right when you pick the deck up. Of course, once you pick a deck, you have to learn it, know how to approach each matchup, and develop an overall game plan for the deck. Learning a deck is a never-ending grind, and once you commit to a ladder deck and master it, you will begin to see crazy gains in trophies. I wish you all successes on the ladder, but unfortunately guys, that's all I've got time for in today's episode. If you enjoyed, please leave a like down below, as well as a subscription to my channel. And as always, this is Legendaray, and I'm signing off. See you guys next time.